The first snow of December arrived quietly in Maple Ridge. White flakes drifted gently through the air, covering rooftops, tree branches, and the little flower garden outside Eleanor Hayes' cottage. Inside, a warm light glowed beside the front window. Every evening, without fail, 82-year-old Eleanor sat in the same rocking chair. A basket of colorful yarn rested beside her feet. Her knitting needles moved slowly, patiently, as though they had all the time in the world. The people in town smiled whenever they walked past her house. There goes Mrs. Hayes, still knitting. Some guessed she made scarves. Others believed she sold baby clothes at holiday markets. A few assumed she simply needed something to pass the time. No one really knew, because Eleanor never explained. She simply smiled and kept knitting. Across the street, 9-year-old Emma watched from her bedroom window. She had been wondering about the little blankets for nearly 2 years. They weren't large enough for a bed. Too small for a child, far too tiny for an adult. Every blanket looked almost identical. Soft pastel colors, neatly folded, finished with extraordinary care. One snowy afternoon, Emma finally gathered enough courage. She crossed the street carrying a plate of freshly baked sugar cookies her mother had made. She knocked gently. A few moments later, the door opened. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Well, Elle, I think someone has brought sunshine with the snow." Emma giggled. "My mom baked cookies. She said you shouldn't spend winter alone." Eleanor laughed softly. "Your mother has always worried about everyone." She welcomed Emma inside. The cottage smelled of cinnamon, fresh tea, and clean wool. Everything felt warm, safe, peaceful. Emma's eyes wandered immediately toward the rocking chair. A tiny cream-colored blanket rested neatly across Eleanor's lap. She had almost finished it. The stitches were perfect, even, gentle, made with hands that had practiced for many decades. Emma couldn't hold her question any longer. "Mrs. Hayes, why are your blankets always so little?" Eleanor looked down at the unfinished blanket. A quiet smile appeared. Instead of answering, she picked it up carefully, placed it into Emma's hands. "It's softer than a cloud," Emma whispered. Eleanor nodded. "It needs to be." Emma looked puzzled. "For who?" Eleanor remained silent for a few seconds, then simply replied, "For someone very small." Emma looked around the room. There were no children, no grandchildren, no toys, no photographs of babies. Only shelves filled with neatly stacked baskets of yarn, and a small wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. Something caught Emma's attention. Inside the cabinet, dozens of notebooks stood in perfect order, each one labeled with a different year, all the way to the present. "Are those your diaries?" Emma asked. Eleanor smiled. "In a way." She gently closed the cabinet door. "Every blanket has its own page." Emma tilted her head. "You remember every single one?" "I try to," Eleanor answered. "Every tiny life deserves to be remembered." Emma wasn't sure what that meant, but somehow the words stayed with her. The kettle began to whistle. Eleanor poured 2 cups of hot chocolate, added tiny marshmallows, then placed a plate of cookies between them. Outside, snow continued falling quietly. Inside, the room glowed with warmth. After a few minutes, Emma looked again at the little blanket. "You must have made hundreds." Eleanor smiled softly. "A few." Emma laughed. "I think that's grandma language for a lot." Eleanor laughed too. "Perhaps." As she reached into the basket beside her chair, pulled out a folded piece of paper, then slipped it carefully inside the blanket before folding it. Emma noticed. "You always put a note inside." Eleanor nodded. "Yes." "What does it say?" Eleanor looked toward the snowy window, then answered quietly, "Something I hope they'll believe." Emma blinked. Eleanor only smiled. "Maybe. You'll understand someday." That evening, Emma walked home through the gently falling snow. She couldn't stop thinking about the tiny blanket, or the mysterious note hidden inside, or the notebooks that filled Eleanor's cabinet. Meanwhile, inside the cottage, Eleanor opened the newest notebook. On the next blank page she wrote carefully, "Blanket 3380 December 6 soft cream wool, finished before the first snowfall." At the bottom of the page she paused, smiled, then slowly wrote one final sentence. "For the little fighter who needs warmth tonight." She gently closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and looked toward the quiet winter sky. No one in Maple Ridge knew that she had written nearly the same sentence every winter for 42 years. The next Saturday morning, Emma woke before sunrise. Fresh snow covered Maple Ridge. Everything outside looked peaceful, white, silent. She looked through her bedroom window. Across the street, Eleanor was already loading a small wicker basket into the trunk of her old blue station wagon. Inside the basket, Emma recognized the tiny cream-colored blanket they had finished only days earlier. Curiosity finally won. Emma hurried downstairs. "I'm going to help Mrs. Hayes." Her mother smiled. "Be back before lunch." Emma nodded enthusiastically, then ran across the snowy street. Eleanor looked pleasantly surprised. "Good morning." Emma caught her breath. "Can I come with you?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then smiled warmly. "I think it's time." The drive took nearly 20 minutes. They left the quiet neighborhoods behind, past frozen fields, small churches, old farms dusted with snow. Finally, the car turned into the parking lot of Maple Ridge Community Hospital. Emma frowned. "I thought we were going shopping." Eleanor smiled gently. "In a way, we are." They carried the basket through the front entrance. The hospital lobby buzzed softly with nurses, visitors, wheelchairs, the distant sound of elevator doors opening and closing. Instead of stopping at the gift shop, Eleanor walked toward another hallway. A sign above the doors read, Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU. Emma had never heard those letters before. She whispered, "What does that mean?" Eleanor answered quietly, "It's where very tiny babies stay. The ones who arrive before they're ready." Emma suddenly looked down at the little blanket in Eleanor's basket. Everything began making sense. Before they entered, a cheerful nurse opened the secure door. She smiled immediately. "Eleanor, we've been hoping to see you." She gave Eleanor a warm hug, then looked toward Emma. "And who's your young helper?" "This is Emma," Eleanor replied. "She likes asking difficult questions." Emma laughed. "I do." The nurse smiled. "I'm Sarah. I answer difficult questions for a living." Inside the NICU, everything felt different. The lights were soft. Machines beeped quietly. Parents whispered to one another. Nurses moved carefully from room to room. Every step seemed gentle, almost respectful. Emma looked through a glass window. Tiny babies rested inside warm incubators. Some were no bigger than dolls. Their hands were so small, they could barely wrap around a single adult finger. Emma felt tears filling her eyes. "They're so little?" Sarah nodded. "They're fighters. Every one of them." Eleanor quietly opened the wicker basket. She lifted out the cream-colored blanket, folded perfectly, wrapped with a pale blue ribbon. Before handing it to Sarah, she slipped a small handwritten card inside. Exactly as she always did. Sarah smiled. "You never forget the note." "I never should," Eleanor replied softly. Emma looked up. "Can I read one?" Eleanor nodded. She handed Emma a blank card. Another identical one remained tucked inside the blanket. Emma slowly read the words. "Dear little one, the world may have greeted you sooner than expected. But never doubt this. You are already deeply loved. Keep fighting. Someone you've never met is believing in you tonight." Emma swallowed hard. "It's beautiful." Sarah smiled. "You'd be surprised. Many parents keep these cards forever." She walked toward a nearby cabinet, opened one drawer. Inside, dozens of envelopes rested neatly together. "Sometimes," she explained, "parents come back years later. They bring us photos. They tell us they still keep Eleanor's note inside their baby's memory box." Emma looked at Eleanor. "You've helped so many families." Eleanor simply shook her head. "I only knitted blankets." Sarah smiled kindly. "You gave frightened parents something warm to hold on the coldest day of their lives." Just then, a young father quietly approached. His eyes looked tired. He carried a tiny pink hat in one hand. Sarah introduced them softly. "This is Michael. His daughter arrived 3 months early." Michael smiled politely, then noticed the blanket in Sarah's hands. His expression changed immediately. As that one of Mrs. Hayes' blankets?" Emma blinked. "You know her?" Michael laughed gently. "I don't." He looked toward Eleanor. "We've never met." Then he carefully reached into his wallet. Between family photographs, he unfolded an old handwritten card. The paper had softened with age. The corners were worn, but the words were still clear. Keep fighting. Someone you've never met is believing in you tonight. Michael smiled. Our son received this blanket 6 years ago. He weighed less than 2 pounds. His voice grew quiet. My wife read this note every single night, when we thought Hay might not survive. He looked toward Eleanor. You'll probably never know what those words meant to us. Eleanor smiled gently. I think your son knows. Michael nodded. He started first grade this year. Emma couldn't stop smiling. She suddenly understood why Eleanor never missed a winter. Before leaving, Sarah placed the new blanket beside a tiny sleeping baby. The little girl instinctively curled her fingers against the soft wool. Her breathing slowed peacefully. Her parents smiled through tears. Eleanor quietly turned away. She never waited to be thanked. She never asked who received the blanket. She simply whispered, "Take good care of her." As they walked back toward the parking lot, Emma finally asked, "Why don't you write your name on the cards?" Snowflakes drifted gently around them. Eleanor looked toward the gray winter sky, then answered softly, "Because I don't want the family remembering me." She smiled. "I want them remembering that kindness found them." Emma looked back at the hospital. She realized something important. Eleanor had probably comforted hundreds of families. Yet almost none of them knew her face. And somehow, she preferred it that way. That evening, back at the cottage, Eleanor opened the notebook once again. Below the entry for blanket Fay 318, she added one more line. Delivered safely. May she always know she arrived surrounded by hope. Then she quietly closed the journal. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside the hospital, a tiny baby slept beneath a warm handmade blanket. Wrapped, not only in wool, but in the quiet love of a grandmother she would probably never meet. The following week, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the tiny babies, or the handwritten notes tucked inside every blanket, or the way Eleanor quietly walked away before anyone could thank her. It didn't seem possible. One person, 42 winters, hundreds of tiny blankets. Why? Saturday afternoon, Emma crossed the street again. This time, she wasn't carrying cookies. She carried a small ball of pale yellow yarn. I bought this with my allowance. She smiled shyly. I thought maybe it could become somebody's blanket. Eleanor's eyes sparkled. I think that's a wonderful beginning. The workshop wasn't filled with woodworking tools like George Miller's had been years ago. Instead, the little sitting room beside the fireplace had become Eleanor's workshop. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Every basket was carefully labeled. Soft white, sky blue, rose pink, mint green, lavender, cream, nothing bright, nothing rough, only colors that felt gentle, peaceful, hopeful. Emma sat beside Eleanor's rocking chair. She watched the knitting needles move with effortless rhythm. Click, click, click. Every stitch looked exactly like the last. How long have you been knitting? Emma finally asked. Eleanor smiled. Since I was 12. So, you've made blankets your whole life? Eleanor shook her head. No, I've only made these for 42 years. Emma glanced toward the wooden cabinet. The notebooks stood exactly where they always had, perfectly arranged, year after year. May I see them? She asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, then slowly nodded. I think you're ready. She unlocked the cabinet with a tiny brass key. Carefully lifted out the oldest notebook. The leather cover had faded with age. Inside, the first page read Winter 1984, blanket Phi 1. Emma turned the page slowly. Every entry looked almost identical. Date, color, yarn, pattern, hospital, then one final sentence. For the little heart learning to beat a little stronger today. Another page. For the parents who haven't stopped believing. Another. For the tiny hands that will someday hold someone else's. Emma smiled. You've written hundreds of these. Eleanor nodded. I've tried never to repeat one. Emma laughed softly. You've written hundreds of love letters. To people you've never met. Eleanor looked down at the notebook. I suppose I have. As Emma carefully turned another page, something unexpected slipped onto the floor. A faded black and white photograph. She picked it up gently. It showed a much younger Eleanor. perhaps 40 years younger, standing beside a hospital bed, smiling through tired eyes. In her arms, she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a knitted blanket. Emma looked closer. The baby's face was almost hidden beneath a wool cap. "Who's this?" she whispered. For several moments, Eleanor said nothing. She simply stared at the photograph, as though it had been waiting patiently all these years. Finally, she smiled. A sad smile, the kind that comes only after many years of healing. "His name," she whispered, "was Daniel?" Emma waited quietly. "He was my son." The room became completely still. Only the crackling fireplace broke the silence. Eleanor gently accepted the photograph. Her fingers rested softly along its worn edges. "Daniel arrived almost 3 months early," she said. "He weighed less than 2 pounds. Emma immediately remembered the babies she had seen inside the NICU. So tiny, so fragile, spent 73 days in the hospital. Eleanor continued. "Every morning, I would sit beside his incubator and pray." She smiled faintly. "There weren't many tiny blankets back then. Nothing soft enough. So, I knitted one myself." Emma looked at the little blanket Eleanor was working on now. "It was the first one." Eleanor nodded slowly. "It was." She closed her eyes for a moment. "I believed, if my little boy felt warmth, he might feel hope too." Emma reached over, gently took Eleanor's hand. "What happened?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled through quiet tears. "The doctors worked miracles. He grew stronger. He learned to breathe. He finally came home." Emma smiled with relief. "Oh yes." Eleanor laughed gently. "He grew into a wonderful man. He became a pediatric doctor. He spent his entire career helping babies, just like he once was." Emma's face brightened. Eleanor nodded proudly. "He always said, someone believed in me before I could believe in myself." She looked down at the old photograph. "I don't know whether it was the blanket, the prayers, the doctors, or simply God's timing. But I promised myself something." Emma listened carefully. "If my little boy survived, I would knit one blanket every winter for another tiny baby." She smiled. "So another frightened mother would never feel as alone as I once did." Emma suddenly understood. This wasn't a hobby. It wasn't charity. It was a promise. One kept for 42 winters. Eleanor opened another notebook. Near the back, Emma noticed something unusual. Every year, there was one extra page. Not for a blanket, not for a hospital. Instead, it simply said, "For Daniel." Each page contained only one sentence. 1985, you smiled for the first time today. 1993, you started middle school and still hug your mother in public. 2004, today you became the kind doctor I always hoped you'd be. 2017, you comfort families exactly the way others once comforted ours. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You've been writing to him every year." Eleanor smiled. Some traditions deserve their own pages. Just then, the telephone rang. Eleanor answered. Her face lit up immediately.
"Daniel?"
She laughed. "I was just thinking about you." Emma quietly smiled. The little premature baby in the old photograph was now a grown man, saving tiny lives, perhaps, wrapped in blankets just like the one his mother had once knitted for him. After the call ended, Eleanor picked up her knitting needles once more. Click, click, click. The familiar rhythm filled the room again. Emma no longer saw a tiny blanket. She saw something much bigger. A mother's gratitude, being woven, one careful stitch at a time. That evening, before closing the notebook, Eleanor wrote one final sentence beneath blanket Faye 319. "May this little blanket remind one family that even the smallest beginnings can grow into beautiful lives." She closed the journal, smiled toward the old photograph resting beside her chair, then quietly whispered, "It all started with you." Winter slowly gave way to spring. The last patches of snow disappeared beneath the morning sun. Tiny green shoots pushed through the frozen ground. Outside Eleanor's cottage, the birds returned to the maple trees. Inside, nothing changed. Every evening, Eleanor still sat beside the front window, a cup of tea, a basket of yarn, and another tiny blanket slowly taking shape beneath her gentle hands. Emma visited almost every afternoon after school. She had learned to knit simple rows. Some stitches were too loose. Others were much too tight. Whenever she frowned at her mistakes, Eleanor smiled. "The babies won't notice," she would say. "They'll only feel that someone cared." One rainy Tuesday, a familiar car pulled into Eleanor's driveway. It was Nurse Sarah from the hospital. She stepped inside carrying a cardboard archive box. Its lid barely stayed closed. "I think." She smiled. "You should both see this." Emma looked inside. The box was filled with envelopes, photographs, greeting cards, tiny footprints printed on hospital paper, even small crayon drawings made by children. "What are they?" Emma asked. Sarah carefully picked up one envelope. "They're thank you letters." Eleanor looked surprised. "I told everyone. They never needed to write." Sarah laughed softly. "I know. They wrote anyway." She placed several letters across the table. Some were only a few lines. Others stretched across many pages. Every envelope carried different handwriting. Different families. Different years. But nearly every one mentioned the same thing: the little handmade blanket. Emma carefully opened the oldest letter. It had been written almost 40 years earlier. "Dear whoever made this blanket, when our daughter arrived at 28 weeks, we were terrified. The first thing that looked like home was your blanket. We still keep it today." Emma swallowed hard. Another letter. "Our twins are now in college. Their tiny blankets have become family treasures. Every Christmas they ask to see them again." Another. "When our son came home after 91 days in the NICU, we wrapped him in your blanket one last time before placing him in his crib. Thank you for helping us believe he would get there." Emma looked toward Eleanor. "Did you know about these?" Eleanor quietly shook her head. "I never asked." Sarah smiled. "That's exactly why I saved them." She opened the archive box further. "There are hundreds." Emma stared. "Hundreds?" Sarah nodded. "Over the years, nurses kept every letter, every photograph. We thought someday you might want to see what your blankets became." Eleanor gently picked up a photograph. It showed a smiling teenager wearing a graduation gown. Around his shoulders, a tiny faded blue blanket. Far too small now, yet still carefully preserved. On the back, someone had written, "You believed in me before I even opened my eyes." Another photograph showed a little girl blowing out birthday candles. The blanket rested beside the cake, folded neatly, protected like a family heirloom. A third picture showed a young woman holding her own newborn baby. Wrapped around the infant was the same tiny blanket she herself had received decades earlier. Emma whispered, "They passed it to the next generation." Sarah smiled. "They said it carried hope." For a long time, no one spoke. The room filled only with the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock. Finally, Sarah reached into the bottom of the archive box. She removed a thick folder. Across the front someone had written, "Blankets of Hope Project." I started counting. Sarah explained, "I wanted to know how many babies had received your blankets." She spread several pages across the table. Hospital delivery records, volunteer logs, old donation forms, boxes carefully checked by year. "I thought it might be 100, she admitted. Emma smiled. "I thought maybe 200. Sarah looked toward Eleanor, then quietly answered, "It was much more." She pointed toward the final page. 2 winters, 319 handmade blankets, 3 regional hospitals, countless volunteer deliveries. Emma blinked. "Only 319. Sarah smiled gently. "No." She turned another page. Many blankets had been used for twins. Some comforted babies transferred between hospitals. Others stayed in family memory boxes. Still others became teaching examples for new NICU nurses. The blankets reached. She paused. "Far more lives than we can count." Oh, Eleanor quietly lowered her eyes. "I only made one at a time." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly the miracle." She continued, "Oh, one family, one winter." She smiled warmly. "Repeated long enough. It changed thousands of lives." Emma looked around the room, at the baskets of yarn, at the notebooks, at the letters covering the table. Suddenly, she realized something. The blankets had never been about wool. They had always been about giving frightened parents something gentle to hold while they waited for hope. Before leaving, Sarah handed Eleanor one final envelope. It was still sealed. No return address, no name, Only 3 handwritten words. Please read alone. Eleanor looked at it thoughtfully, then placed it beside her notebook. I'll open it tonight, she said quietly. Emma noticed something unusual. For the first time, Eleanor looked nervous. Not frightened, just deeply thoughtful. As though she somehow knew whatever waited inside that envelope would change something. That evening, after Emma had gone home, the cottage became quiet again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The fire crackled beside Eleanor's chair. She slowly picked up the mysterious envelope, looked at it for a long moment, then carefully opened it. Inside, she found a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The moment she saw the picture, her hands began to tremble. That evening, the rain continued falling softly outside Eleanor's cottage. The fire glowed gently beside her rocking chair. The mysterious envelope rested quietly in her hands. For several moments, she simply looked at it, as though she already knew. Whatever waited inside would be impossible to forget. She carefully unfolded the letter. A photograph slipped into her lap. It showed a smiling little girl, perhaps 7 years old. Curly brown hair, bright blue eyes. She held a faded lavender blanket tightly against her chest. Though it had become much too small, she refused to let it go. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "She still sleeps with it every night." Eleanor smiled softly, then began reading. "Dear Mrs. Hayes, you don't know us. We never had the courage to introduce ourselves, but our daughter received one of your blankets 7 years ago." Her eyes moved slowly across the page. She was born weighing only 1 pound and 14 ounces. The doctors warned us to prepare for the worst. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered those words. Different parents, different babies, the same fear, again and again. She continued reading. "One night, my husband and I were sitting outside the NICU. We had already decided we couldn't survive losing another child." The next lines made Eleanor's hands tremble. "We had lost our first baby 3 years earlier. When Emma arrived too early, we believed history was repeating itself." Tears quietly rolled down Eleanor's cheeks. The letter continued. "A nurse placed your little lavender blanket over our daughter. Inside it was your note. The world may have greeted you sooner than expected. Never doubt this. You are already deeply loved." My wife read those words aloud, again, and again, and again. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. Eleanor covered her mouth. She had written those words without ever knowing where they would travel. The father continued. "You didn't only comfort our daughter, you saved her parents. That night, we decided to keep believing. 7 years later, our daughter is healthy. She loves drawing. She wants to become a nurse someday. Every birthday, she thanks the woman she has never met." The final lines were written in a child's handwriting. Large letters, slightly uneven. "Dear Blanket Grandma, thank you for keeping me warm. I hope I can help babies too someday. Love, Emma." Eleanor gently folded the letter against her heart. For a long while, she simply cried, not because she was sad, but because love had quietly returned home. The next morning, Emma came across the street as usual. She immediately noticed the photograph lying beside Eleanor's notebook. "What happened?" she asked gently. Without saying a word, Eleanor handed her the letter. Emma read every sentence, slowly, carefully. By the end, she could no longer hide her tears. "They were going to lose another baby," she whispered. Eleanor nodded. They almost lost hope, and Emma looked at the tiny lavender blanket in the photograph. So, it wasn't only for the babies. Eleanor smiled warmly. It never was. She looked toward the window where soft morning sunlight reflected across the melting snow. Sometimes, the smallest blanket wraps around an entire family. That afternoon, Nurse Sarah returned once more. This time, she carried a formal invitation. Beautiful cream-colored paper. A gold ribbon. The hospital's seal embossed across the top. Sarah smiled. The hospital board voted unanimously. She handed the invitation to Eleanor. Maple Ridge Community Hospital invites Eleanor Hayes to a celebration honoring 42 years of compassion. Emma smiled excitedly. "They're giving you an award." Eleanor quietly sighed. "Oh dear." Sarah laughed. "I knew you'd say that. Eleanor looked almost embarrassed. I don't need a ceremony. You deserve one. Sarah replied gently. Eleanor shook her head. No. She looked toward the basket of unfinished blankets beside her chair. If people want to thank someone, thank the nurses. Thank the doctors. Thank the parents who never stopped believing. Emma smiled. And who should thank you? Eleanor laughed softly. The babies, she teased. They already have. Sarah opened another folder. There is one more thing. She explained that the hospital wanted to create a permanent display. Not a statue. Not a portrait. Something different. A place where every NICU family could leave a photograph, a note, or a memory. A wall of hope. They wanted to call it the Blanket of Hope Gallery. Eleanor looked thoughtful. If, she said quietly, it reminds frightened parents that other families made it through. She smiled. Then I'd be honored. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. That's exactly why we hoped you'd say yes. Later that evening, Emma helped Eleanor organize another basket of yarn. There was enough wool for perhaps 10 more blankets. Maybe 15. Emma picked up a pale blue skein. Do you ever think about stopping? Eleanor looked down at her knitting needles, then toward the letters spread across the table. Photographs of smiling children, graduation pictures, birthday parties, first days of school. She smiled. I'll stop. The day babies stop arriving early. Emma laughed through happy tears. I guess that won't be any time soon. The click, click, click. The knitting needles began moving again, steady, gentle, faithful, just as they had every winter for 42 years. Outside, the last snowflakes of the season quietly disappeared. Inside, another tiny blanket slowly grew, one careful stitch at a time. Spring slowly settled over Maple Ridge. The maple trees wore fresh green leaves. The mornings felt warmer. The birds returned to the gardens outside Eleanor's cottage. For most people, it was simply another beautiful season. For Eleanor, it felt different. She noticed it first while knitting. Her hands paused more often. The needles slipped from her fingers. Sometimes, she had to rest after only a few rows. Emma watched quietly. She pretended not to notice. But one afternoon, after Eleanor accidentally dropped her knitting needles for the third time, Emma gently picked them up. Are your hands hurting? Eleanor smiled. A little. The doctor says they're getting older. She laughed softly. I suppose they finally realized I'm 82. Emma didn't laugh. She looked down at the unfinished blanket. Only half completed. For the first time, she wondered if Eleanor might not be able to finish it. A few days later, Dr. Daniel Hayes arrived from the children's hospital. He still visited every weekend whenever he could, though now his own hair carried touches of silver. His smile was still the same one Eleanor remembered from childhood. He gently examined his mother's hands. Your arthritis is getting worse, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. I know. You need to rest. Daniel continued. No more knitting for several hours every day. But she smiled. And what should I tell the babies? Daniel laughed gently. I think they'd want you to take care of yourself too. Eleanor looked toward the basket of unfinished yarn. I promised, she whispered. Daniel reached for her hand. You already kept your promise. For 42 years. She gently shook her head. As long as one more baby arrives, there should be one more blanket. Daniel didn't argue, because he understood. Some promises become part of who we are. The following Saturday, the hospital held its annual celebration of hope. Families gathered from across the county. Doctors, nurses, volunteers, former NICU parents, children who had once weighed less than 2 pounds, now running through the hospital garden laughing together. Eleanor almost didn't attend. She disliked ceremonies. She disliked standing on stages even more. Emma smiled. You always tell me. Sometimes we accept kindness, so others can give it. Eleanor laughed. I suppose I did say that. When they arrived, she expected a small gathering, perhaps a few nurses, a short speech, maybe coffee and cake afterward. Instead, she stopped walking. The hospital courtyard was filled with people, hundreds of them. Families stretched across the lawn. Children played beneath colorful balloons. Doctors stood beside former patients. Everywhere Eleanor looked, Someone was smiling at her. She whispered, "Oh my." Sarah walked over with tears already in her eyes. "I tried to warn you." Eleanor looked around in amazement. "Who are all these people?" Sarah smiled. "They're your blankets." At first, Eleanor didn't understand. Then, one family stepped forward. A mother carried a tiny faded blue blanket. Its edges had softened with age. She held it as carefully as if it had been made yesterday. Another family approached. Their son, now a college student, carried a pale yellow blanket folded inside a memory box. Another little girl proudly held a lavender blanket decorated with tiny stars. Then another. And another. Soon, the courtyard became a sea of tiny handmade blankets. Blue, pink, cream, mint green, lavender, white. Hundreds of them. Each one lovingly preserved, each one carrying decades of memories. Emma quietly whispered, "They kept them." Sarah nodded. Almost all of them. Many families had traveled for hours. Some had flown from other states. One family had driven all night, not because they wanted an award, not because they wanted recognition, simply because they wanted Eleanor to know her kindness had never been forgotten. A young woman approached. She looked to be in her early 20s. She held a faded cream-colored blanket. "My name is Lily," she smiled. "I was blanket number 37. Everyone laughed softly. Lily continued, "My parents told me." They were terrified. But every time they looked at this blanket, they remembered. Someone they had never met believed I would survive. She hugged Eleanor tightly. "Now I'm studying nursing. I'll begin working in an ICU next month." Eleanor could barely speak. An older man stepped forward next. He carried twin blankets, one pink, one blue. "Our twins are 30 years old now." He smiled proudly. "They both became elementary school teachers." He laughed. "We still argue over which blanket belongs to which twin." The crowd laughed warmly. Then Sarah walked onto the small stage. She didn't begin with statistics or awards. Instead, she pointed toward the families gathered across the courtyard. "Eleanor," she said softly, "you always believed you were knitting blankets." She smiled. "Today, I think everyone here would tell you hope. You were knitting hope." The crowd applauded. Not loudly, not wildly, just long enough for every family to say, "Thank you." Sarah then invited anyone who wished to place their blanket on a long white table prepared beneath the trees. One by one, families came forward, carefully unfolding blankets that had protected newborns decades earlier. Some carried tiny footprints still tucked inside. Others still held Eleanor's handwritten note. Many had become worn with love. None had lost their meaning. When the final blanket had been placed, the table stretched nearly the entire length of the courtyard. 319 handmade blankets. Side by side, like a patchwork quilt stitched together by 40, two winners of compassion. Eleanor slowly walked beside them, running her fingertips gently across the soft wool. She didn't remember every pattern or every color, but she remembered every prayer. At the very end of the table, she quietly stopped. There rested the very first blanket she had ever knitted. The one she had made for baby Daniel. Daniel smiled. "I thought it belonged here today." Mother and son stood silently together. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Sometimes, love speaks most clearly through memories. As the ceremony ended, the hospital director approached Eleanor with a small wooden box. Inside rested a silver knitting needle, mounted beneath a simple plaque. It read, "Every stitch carried hope. Every blanket carried love. Every life carried the warmth forward." Eleanor smiled, then gently closed the box. "I'll treasure it," she said. "Tomorrow," she looked toward Emma. "I think we still have a blanket to finish." Emma laughed through tears. "Yes, we do." That evening, back at the cottage, the unfinished blanket rested once again in Eleanor's lap. She picked up her knitting needles. Her fingers moved more slowly than before, but they still moved. Click, click, click. Outside, the stars quietly filled the spring sky. Inside, one more tiny blanket, one more quiet promise, continued to grow. Summer slowly faded into autumn. The maple leaves turned shades of gold. Cool winds carried the scent of fallen leaves through Maple Ridge. Inside Eleanor's cottage, the rocking chair still sat beside the window. The basket of yarn remained beside it. Only now, it stayed untouched for longer each day. Emma still visited every afternoon. Sometimes she knitted. Sometimes she simply read aloud while Eleanor rested. Neither of them worried about filling every moment with conversation. Some friendships were comfortable enough to share silence. One chilly October evening, Eleanor looked toward the window. A flock of geese crossed the orange sky. "They know winter is coming," she whispered. Emma smiled. "So do we?" Eleanor nodded gently. "I've always loved winter." Emma laughed. "Most people complain about it." Eleanor looked down at the tiny blanket resting across her lap. Winter reminds people how much warmth matters. As the weeks passed, her strength slowly faded. Walking across the cottage became tiring. Knitting for an hour became difficult. Even holding a teacup sometimes required both hands. Daniel visited more often. Though he was a pediatrician, he was simply a son when he walked through his mother's front door. He made soup, watered her flowers, repaired the loose gate, then quietly sat beside her, exactly as she had once sat beside his incubator. One afternoon, Eleanor handed Daniel a small wooden box. Inside were the brass key to the notebook cabinet and a folded letter. "When the time comes," she smiled gently, "give these to Emma." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom," she squeezed his hand. "We've both spent our lives helping babies," she said softly. "We know. Every life begins, and every life ends." Her voice remained peaceful. "I'm not afraid." The first snowfall arrived earlier than usual. Emma rushed across the street carrying cinnamon bread still warm from the oven. She opened the cottage door. The familiar scent of wool greeted her. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted quietly outside. Everything felt exactly the same, except Eleanor remained asleep in her rocking chair. The unfinished blanket rested gently across her lap. Emma carefully tucked another blanket around her shoulders. She didn't wake her. She simply sat nearby, knitting quietly. The two rocking chairs moved gently together, one awake, one dreaming. Several days later, Eleanor asked Emma to help her finish the final blanket, not because she couldn't knit anymore, but because she wanted every stitch to belong to both of them. They worked side by side, one row from Eleanor, one row from Emma, back and forth, slowly, patiently, until the last stitch was complete. Eleanor folded it carefully, smoothed each corner, then tucked one final handwritten note inside. Emma watched as she wrote. The handwriting was slightly shakier than before, but every word remained beautiful. "Dear little one, may this blanket remind you that love often arrives before words ever can. Long before you know our names them, someone is already hoping for your tomorrow." She smiled. "I think that one says everything." A week before Christmas, Eleanor called Daniel and Emma into the sitting room. She placed the newest notebook on the table. Its final page had already been written. Blanket Fay 320 finished together. Beneath it, only one sentence. "No blanket is ever woven by one pair of hands alone." Emma quietly wiped away tears. Christmas morning arrived. Snow covered every rooftop. Church bells echoed through town. Children laughed outside building snowmen. Inside the cottage, everything was peaceful. Eleanor remained in her favorite rocking chair, wrapped in the same quilt Daniel had given her many years earlier. A gentle smile rested on her face. One hand still touched the basket of soft yarn beside her. She had passed away quietly during the night, as peacefully as a candle gently fading after filling a room with light. The news spread slowly through Maple Ridge. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Everyone somehow felt winter had become quieter. The funeral took place 3 days later, exactly as Eleanor had requested. Simple, warm, filled with music rather than sorrow. Instead of expensive flowers, families carried tiny knitted blankets. Some were new. Some had faded with time. Some still held the handwritten notes Eleanor had tucked inside decades earlier. The church slowly filled with soft colors. Cream, pink, blue, mint green. Every blanket represented a child, a family, a story of hope. Sarah stepped to the front of the church. She unfolded Eleanor's final letter. The room became completely silent. She began reading. "If you're hearing these words, then I have finally put down my knitting needles. Gentle laughter drifted through the room, exactly as Eleanor would have wanted. Sarah continued. Please don't remember me because I made blankets. Remember the parents who never gave up. Remember the nurses who stayed through the night. Remember the doctors who fought for tiny hearts. And most of all, remember the babies who taught us how strong hope can be. She turned to the final page. If you wish to honor my memory, please don't buy flowers. Buy yarn. A few quiet chuckles mixed with tears. Sit beside someone who feels alone. Teach a child to knit. Wrap another family in kindness. Love becomes warmer every time it is shared. Not a single dry eye remained in the church. After the service, no one hurried home. Families slowly walked toward Eleanor's cottage. They stood quietly outside beneath the falling snow. No speeches, no announcements, only silence. Then, Emma sat down in the empty rocking chair beside the window. She picked up Eleanor's knitting needles. Without saying a word, she cast the first stitch. An elderly woman from the church quietly joined her. Then another. Then Sarah. Then several mothers whose babies had once received Eleanor's blankets. Soon, dozens of people sat together on the porch, knitting, talking softly, sharing yarn, sharing stories, sharing hope. Snow continued falling gently around them. Inside the cottage, the fire still glowed warmly. Outside, a new tradition had already begun. Without anyone planning it. Without anyone giving instructions. Exactly the way Eleanor would have loved. 5 years passed. Winter arrived in Maple Ridge just as it always had. Snow settled softly across rooftops. Smoke curled from old chimneys. The hospital windows glowed warmly against the cold December evening. Yet something had changed. What had once been one grandmother sitting quietly beside a window had become hundreds of hands working together. Every Thursday evening, the lights inside Eleanor's cottage shone once again. Not because Eleanor was there, but because the house had become known throughout the town as the Blanket Circle. Children sat beside retired teachers. College students knitted beside grandfathers who had never held knitting needles before. Former NICU parents taught new volunteers. Doctors, nurses, firefighters, high school students. Everyone came for the same reason, not to become experts. Simply to help one tiny baby they would probably never meet. Emma was no longer the shy little girl who had carried cookies across the street. She was now 14. Confident, patient, kind. She still sat in Eleanor's favorite rocking chair. Not because it belonged to her, because she wanted every new volunteer to remember who had started it all. Above the fireplace, a small wooden sign hung where Eleanor's family portrait once rested. It simply read, "Every stitch says, you are not alone." The sign had become the group's promise. Every volunteer quietly touched it before beginning a new blanket. The hospital soon noticed something remarkable. There were no longer enough premature babies in Maple Ridge to receive all the blankets, so they began sharing them with neighboring hospitals, then neighboring counties. Eventually, hospitals across the entire state began requesting them. The newspapers gave the movement a name: the Blanket Circle Project. Emma smiled every time she heard it. To her, it would always be Mrs. Hayes knitting beside the window. One snowy afternoon, Sarah arrived carrying exciting news. The State Children's Hospital called. She smiled. They've asked if we can help start blanket circles in other cities. The room became completely silent. Then, everyone smiled. One elderly volunteer laughed softly. So, we've become teachers. Emma nodded. I think Eleanor would have liked that. Within 2 years, blanket circles appeared across the country. Small groups gathered inside churches, libraries, community centers, schools, retirement homes. Every winter, thousands of tiny blankets traveled quietly toward NICUs. No advertisements, no fundraising campaigns, only ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. Back in Maple Ridge, Emma continued keeping Eleanor's notebooks. Every blanket still received its own page. Every entry followed Eleanor's tradition: color, pattern, hospital, and one final blessing. One evening, Emma carefully wrote blanket Fen 998 soft cream wool, December 9th. Then, she smiled, added one final sentence: for the little dreamer who has already taught someone what courage looks like. Sarah looked over her shoulder. You still write them exactly like Eleanor. And Emma smiled. No. She shook her head gently. I write them the way kindness sounds. A week later, Blanket Fine 999 was finished. The entire group gathered around to admire it. No one had expected the number to grow so large. Then came the final skein of yarn, soft pale blue. The same color Eleanor had loved most. Everyone knew what it meant. Blanket 1000. Emma decided something special. Every volunteer would knit one small section, one row, one stitch, no matter how experienced, no matter how imperfect. Children knitted uneven rows. Grandparents corrected tiny mistakes. Doctors knitted during lunch breaks. Nurses worked between night shifts. Parents whose babies had once received Eleanor's blankets returned to help. 43 different people contributed to the same blanket. When it was finally finished, it was impossible to tell where one person's stitches ended and another's began. Emma smiled. It's perfect. An elderly volunteer laughed. It certainly isn't. Emma gently folded the blanket. It is, because everyone is inside it. That evening, as Emma prepared to record Blanket 1000, she noticed something unusual. At the back of Eleanor's cabinet, behind the 43 completed notebooks, one final notebook remained. Plain brown leather. No year written on the cover. No number. Emma frowned. I've never seen this one. Daniel looked surprised. I haven't either. The notebook was tied with a faded blue ribbon. Across the front, in Eleanor's handwriting, were 4 simple words. Open when needed. Emma slowly untied the ribbon. The first pages were blank. Then, near the middle, she found a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. It had clearly been written long before Eleanor became elderly, perhaps decades earlier. Emma carefully unfolded it. Daniel stood quietly beside her. Sarah gently wiped away a tear before she had even read the first line. Emma began reading aloud. One day, someone else will finish a blanket I never started. The room became perfectly still. She continued. That won't mean my story ended. It will mean kindness finally learned how to continue without me. Emma's voice trembled. If that day ever comes, please don't ask whether the blankets still matter. Walk into any NICU. Look at a frightened mother holding her baby for the first time. You'll have your answer. The final paragraph had been written more slowly, almost as though Eleanor had smiled while writing it. Love is never measured by how many people know your name. It is measured by how many people feel less alone because you lived. Emma gently closed the notebook. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every person in the room already understood. Outside, snow continued falling quietly across Maple Ridge. Inside Blanket, Faye 1000 rested beside the window, waiting for the tiny baby, who had no idea how many loving hands had already been hoping for tomorrow. 20 years passed. Winter still arrived quietly in Maple Ridge. Snow blanketed the rooftops. The old church bell still rang every Sunday morning. The children's hospital continued welcoming new lives into the world. One thing had grown far beyond anything Eleanor Hayes could have imagined. The blanket circle was no longer just a tradition in one small town. It had spread across the country, then beyond it. Hospitals in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, and dozens of other countries now received handmade blankets every winter. No one knew exactly how many volunteers had joined, only that every December, thousands of people quietly picked up knitting needles. Because one grandmother had once decided that frightened families should never face winter alone. Television stations occasionally told Eleanor's story. Universities invited doctors to speak about the emotional importance of comfort during neonatal care. Researchers published studies showing that compassionate support often helped parents cope during the most difficult days of their lives. Yet every article ended with the same truth. The movement had never been about blankets. It had always been about reminding people that hope could arrive through the smallest acts of kindness. The little cottage on Maple Street still stood beneath the old maple tree. Its white porch had been repainted many times. The garden bloomed every spring. Inside, the rocking chair remained beside the same front window. No one ever moved it, not because it was valuable, but because some places become part of a story. Emma was now 34 years old. a pediatric nurse. She had chosen the same calling that Daniel had followed decades earlier. Every Thursday evening, after finishing her hospital shift, she unlocked Eleanor's cottage, lit the fireplace, placed fresh tea on the table, and welcomed new volunteers into the blanket circle. Children still arrived with their grandparents. Teenagers completed their very first blankets. Retired couples laughed over uneven stitches. Parents whose babies had once received Eleanor's blankets returned years later, this time carrying children old enough to learn how to knit for someone else. One snowy evening, a young boy hesitated outside the cottage door. He looked no older than 8. He held a ball of pale blue yarn against his chest. His grandmother smiled gently. "Go on." The boy stepped inside. He looked around nervously, then asked, "Miss Emma, I've never knitted before." Emma smiled. Her heart immediately remembered another little girl, another winter, another question. She knelt beside him, placed a pair of knitting needles gently into his hands, then smiled. "Neither had I. The first time I sat beside Mrs. Hayes." The boy looked surprised. "Were you scared?" Emma laughed softly. "Very." She guided his hands around the soft yarn. "Everyone begins with one stitch." Around the room, the familiar rhythm filled the cottage once again. Click, click. Knitting needles moved gently beneath the warm light. The sound had become the heartbeat of the house. When everyone finished for the evening, Emma walked to the old notebook cabinet. 43 journals rested neatly on the shelf. Beside them, hundreds more had been added over the years. Each recorded another blanket, another family, another winter, another quiet act of love. Above the cabinet hung Eleanor's final handwritten note. It had been carefully framed. Every volunteer read it before leaving. Emma looked up, then slowly read the familiar words aloud. "You may never know the child who receives your blanket. You may never meet their parents. You may never hear their story, but kindness has never needed introductions. If your hands can comfort someone, use them. If your heart still has love to give, share it." That is how ordinary people quietly change the world. The room remained silent. Several volunteers quietly wiped away tears. Just then, Daniel entered the cottage carrying a small package. His hair had turned completely silver now, but his smile remained exactly the same. He handed the package to Emma. "I think it belongs here." Inside rested the very first blanket Eleanor had knitted for him as a premature baby. The cream-colored wool had faded with time. Several stitches had loosened over the decades. It was no longer perfect. Perhaps it never had been. Emma carefully placed it inside a glass display case near the front window. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "Blanket Fay 1, every act of kindness begins with someone willing to start." No expensive memorial, no marble statue, no grand monument, only a tiny handmade blanket. Exactly the way Eleanor would have wanted. As evening settled over Maple Ridge, snowflakes drifted softly outside the window. Inside, children laughed while learning their first stitches. Parents folded newly finished blankets. Grandparents patiently untangled yarn. The cottage glowed with warmth, not because of the fireplace, but because of the people gathered inside. Quietly opened the newest notebook. She wrote carefully, "Blanket 84 862 2 finished on the first snowfall of December, knitted by 12 volunteers." She smiled, then added one final sentence. "For the little heart that has already inspired strangers to love before they ever meet you." She gently closed the notebook, looked toward Eleanor's empty rocking chair, and whispered, "We're still knitting." Outside, the first snow continued falling. Inside the hospital across town, a nurse unfolded a brand new handmade blanket. She wrapped it around a tiny newborn. Inside, as always, rested a handwritten note. "Dear little one, the world may seem very big today. Before you opened your eyes, someone was already hoping for your tomorrow. You are loved. You are never alone." The baby's tiny fingers curled around the soft wool. The frightened parents smiled through tears. Once again, hope had arrived quietly, wrapped in warmth. Eleanor Hayes never appeared on magazine covers. She never became famous. She never expected recognition. She simply kept one promise, one tiny blanket, every winter, for 42 years, and in doing so, she proved a beautiful truth. The greatest legacies are not measured by how many people remember our names. They are measured by how many lives become warmer, because we chose to care. The end title: she knitted one tiny blanket every winter, after Grandma was gone. Hundreds of premature babies were still wrapped in her love.